Well, Russia's Wagner Group has played a key role in the war in Ukraine, winning several battles and last month launching a short-lived mutiny against Russia's military leadership. Now, in a voice message posted on Telegram, its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, says he has paused fighter recruitment, but that Wagner's activities will continue in Africa and Belarus. Some Wagner fighters relocated to Belarus after their failed rebellion, raising concerns among NATO neighbors. Moscow, meanwhile, has remained tight-lipped about the impact the war is having on its troops. But a new law in Russia could provide some insight into one of its closest held secrets. Last week, Russia's parliament agreed to raise the age limit for military conscription from 27 to 30 years of age. That's after President Putin already announced the mobilization of 300,000 troops last September. Moscow hasn't revealed the number of troops deployed against Ukraine, but earlier this year, Ukrainian military intelligence claimed that figure stood at around 280,000. The British defense minister has said 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine. Well, Moscow has publicly acknowledged the deaths of only 6,000 soldiers, but independent Russian media outlets working with Germany's Tübingen University put that number at close to 50,000. There is no independent information on the number of people who've deserted the Russian army, but human rights groups say there are more than 1,000 court cases against alleged Russian deserters. Some rights groups say that figure is even higher. So recent moves by the government indicate Russia needs even more troops. Along with a law aimed at raising the maximum conscription age, it will also be harder for people who are drafted to leave the country. The Kremlin's official reason: Russia needs better defenses.
Russia needs more experienced, meaning older, soldiers. At least that's how its parliament justified raising the minimum and maximum recruitment ages for the army. Until now, men between 18 and 27 were enlisted. In the future, they say,
citizens between 21 and 30 years old will be called up for military service.
That was the plan a month ago. But the final law that passed only raised the upper limit. The minimum age will remain 18 years. The parliamentary defense chief called it a necessary step to create a better force.
We considered all the advantages and disadvantages and came to the decision that it's better this way. We always need a well-prepared mobile mobilization reserve.
Critics reading between the lines say Moscow needs more soldiers, and in a hurry. At the moment, Russia is lacking troops. These resources need to come from somewhere. For example, men over the age of 27. Now they're the ones who have been chosen as victims. The new law means Russia's army could grow by an estimated 2 million. Officials say the recruits will not be sent to fight in Ukraine, but many are afraid that's exactly the fate that awaits them, as reinforcements for the front line. The Kremlin hasn't commented on the new law, referring questions to the defense ministry instead. But some parliamentarians are clearer. They even refer to the fighting in Ukraine as a war, and not a special military operation.
This law was written for general mobilization and large-scale war. It already smells like large-scale war.
A war which rights organizations say more and more Russian men are trying to escape. There are more than 1,000 cases against deserters since mobilization began. At the same time, it's clear that by no means are they all being investigated. For one thing, it's very costly, and also the whole mobilization mechanism is running quite badly. In reality, the number of deserters is much higher. Now, even more men of recruitment age are likely to try to get out of Russia as soon as they can. Because once they've received their conscription order, they're required to stay in the country. Since those orders are now sent out digitally, there's no escaping them anymore.
And I'm delighted to welcome Catherine Belton, a veteran journalist specializing in Russia, now at the Washington Post. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Why do you think Russia is raising the age of compulsory service?
I think it's clear that now that there's this intensified fighting in Ukraine, now that Ukraine has launched the counteroffensive, they really are in need of manpower. And we really get the sense now that Russia is digging in for the long haul. You heard just there in that segment, the head of the Duma's Defense Committee, the head of the Parliamentary Defense Committee, Andrei Katapalev, say this smells now like a large-scale war. This is preparation for mobilization. And it really looks like they need more manpower. And yes, by increasing the conscription age to 30 by 3 years, then they stand to be able to increase the recruitment pool by hundreds of thousands. And as you said, by potentially up to 2 million men.
So just to be clear, it is to boost fighting forces in Ukraine, as some fear, rather than bringing more experienced soldiers into the force, as the Kremlin claims it is doing.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a two-pronged policy because they've also increased the age for reservists, for officers, those with military experience already. They can now be forced to go off to Ukraine right up to the age of 55 or 60 for the most senior officers. And this really speaks to a dearth of staff. And it really seems pretty clear that Russia wouldn't even be considering this move to increase the conscription age. And this is to 30, and this is the age for which young Russians have to do a year's compulsory military service. Yes, Russia says officially they won't be sent to the front, but it's clear they're not doing this for no reason. They need to prepare men for the front, and there's a real fear that this will be the ultimate aim.
And what does that tell us about the wider state of Russia's war against Ukraine? Is manpower the biggest weak point here?
They've kept a very tight lid on the casualty rate. The official numbers that the Defense Ministry have put the number of dead only at 6,000. As your report pointed out, independent media outlets have put that figure at somewhere near 50,000. It's very difficult to know because they've been keeping such a tight guard on the figures. The independent media outlets base their calculations on official funeral rates and so on. So it's really difficult to guess. But the fact is, though, Russia still has a lot more manpower than Ukraine because the population is many times larger. So unfortunately, they can keep going for a while.
And when you're trying to get a handle on the numbers, trying to get the most reliable information possible out of Russia, where are you looking to find that?
It's difficult. I mean, I think in this case we have to rely on the figures put out by these very well-regarded independent media outlets. There's one called Medusa, and obviously they conducted their research in concert with Tübingen University. So I think these figures are pretty reliable. They've been working hard to really get a look at this.
Yeah. Now, I also want to ask, with the increased chance that men are going to be forced to fight, and now also more recently seeing drone attacks on Russian soil, do you think that these factors will come together to produce any kind of sea change among public attitudes toward the war on Ukraine?
Already we've seen public opinion in Russia shifting towards hopes for peace talks. We've seen in recent opinion polls that more than 50% of Russians would like there to be peace negotiations. Of course, the war plays well with a very vocal minority, but in fact, most of the population by now are pretty unhappy with where things are going. But that doesn't, unfortunately, translate into any protest when you face jail sentences of up to 15 years for calling the war a war, in essence. So, it's very difficult for anyone to protest against this. And so far, the mobilization has concentrated on Russia's far-flung regions where men have very little rights and their families have very little rights too. And it's very easy for the Kremlin to keep a lid on the news and the number of deaths in those regions. But as the war grinds on, it will have to go to the bigger cities. And we already see, just by the fact that it's having to increase the conscript age, that they do need more manpower, which means it's going to touch the cities at some point. And this is going to kind of be quite a sensitive moment. And already we hear talk about this general mobilization. It's going to be, last time when Putin launched his partial mobilization last September, after having promised at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine that there would be no mobilization at all, that it would only be the professional army that was sent in. We saw then 700,000, estimated 700,000 flee the country. And now Russia has clamped down on those laws. The minute you receive your conscription papers, you're not going to be allowed to leave the country. Fines have gone up for avoiding the draft tenfold. It will cost you $300 or more. And you also won't be able to get a mortgage, any bank loans. So you could see increased nervous.
Catherine, I'm so sorry to cut you off there. We're out of time. This has been fascinating, though. We really appreciate you joining us on The Day to share your insights.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Sarah Pagung is a Russia expert who works at the Kerber Foundation. That's a think tank here in Berlin. Sarah, thanks for your time today. Russia says that extending its conscription is all about recruiting more experienced fighters. Do you believe that?
I think it's more in general about enlarging the group of possible draftees. Russia is certainly preparing for a long-term war, so it definitely needs to find conscript and draftees, not only in the upcoming weeks and months, but possibly also in the upcoming years. And what we've seen now with this law is just preparing for this.
Mm-hmm. How will this go down in Russia? I mean, we're hearing, the likelihood that many Russian men are likely to push back against this.
So what the law also does is just reducing the possibilities for dodging the draft by increasing the fines for dodging the draft. This is something that probably will go down badly with a lot of Russian families, as dodging conscription and draft has been quite common in Russia. However, the draft maybe structure that we have seen over the last 1.5 years in Russia is something that is particularly targeting not the big urban centers of Russia like Moscow or St. Petersburg, but more remote regions. So thereby kind of trying to avoid greater dissatisfactions in the really crucial areas of Russia with the Russian government.
OK, so let's say that this is effective, that they do recruit more soldiers. But even if Russia has more soldiers, does it have enough military equipment for these soldiers to use?
So probably yes, but it depends on, how good or how well you want to arm these soldiers. What we've seen anecdotally about the last 1.5 years, that Russia has a lot of equipment that is probably not really sufficient to equip everybody well. But as we see at the moment now, it's still enough to, form a really good working defense in the Russian fight against the Ukrainian offensive. So I do think that there is enough equipment to basically hold on to what Russia at the moment has. If it's really, if Russia really has enough equipment to maybe go on the counteroffensive after Ukraine's offensive now, I think that is a different question. I would be more skeptical here.
OK. And what about training up all of these new recruits? I mean, just because they're slightly older, it doesn't mean that they're going to be experienced soldiers. So is that going to be something that will take a while?
Honestly speaking, I don't really think that this enlargement is about recruiting more experienced soldiers. I think this is more just a frame that Russian politicians try to or use to to justify this law. Because if we look at, the structure of how Russia is recruiting soldiers, the point where they were recruiting experienced soldiers, because there were still experienced people that haven't been drafted or conscripted to the Russia's armed forces, are actually over. A lot of them are already, within the armed forces or other paramilitary structures. So I think it's more about, enlarging in general than really about targeting more military experienced groups.
All right, and just very briefly, we've got 20 seconds. I mean, is this going to impact Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia?
In the long term, maybe, because this conscription law will work over the long term, over the next month and year, so it probably won't affect the currently ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive. But it is certainly a sign that Russia is not ready to bow down and really plans for a long-term war in Ukraine and to really push for its war objectives in Ukraine.
All right, Sarah Pagung from the Kuba Foundation think tank. Thanks so much.